welcome to my insights into the Parsifal Overture by Wagner. I chose this piece to talk about today because I think it's one of the most beautiful pieces in romantic music. I also think there's a really amazing performance history and critical history. Many critics have argued about what this opera could possibly be about. Some have argued that it's about the glory of religion in general. As you can see here, the words of communion fit very nicely to the opening phrases of the overture. Some have argued that it's about the Christian-Judaism divide in Europe, and others have argued that it's about hope, or Milfried and compassion. Some have argued that it's a direct contradiction to Wagner's previous opera, Tristan and Isolde, where Tristan is in fact a victim of compassion and hope. In this one, Parsifal is saved by compassion and hope. Schopenhauer, the philosopher, and Wagner realized that the only way to cure the earth of evil was compassion. Edward Hanslick, the German Bohemian art critic, described this opera as a superior magic opera which revels in the wondrous. In fact, the opera had mixed reviews. Ein Bühnenweiferspiel, or a festival play for the consecration of the stage, which was the opera's alternative title, was only allowed to play at Wagner's own theatre in Bayreuth. In fact, Bayreuth had a 30-year hold over any performances. Stravinsky, Debussy, and Berg made the trip to Bayreuth to watch the opera when it was first premiered. Debussy called it one of the most beautiful moments ever raised to music. Stravinsky compared the theatre to a crematorium. Wagner realized himself first as a poet, and when he had fully written the script, could he then become a musician or the composer? It was very clear in his libretto for Parsifal that he's inspired by poetry and mythology. In fact, the word parsa and fal means hopeless fool in its origins. The opera is about the land of the Holy Grail and the land of Klingsor, the evil realm. The character Parsifal is stuck between the two realms, and he has to retrieve a sword. It's said that the Holy Grail could represent Christianity, and the evil realm could represent Judaism. Parsifal instead learns about a world of compassion, a world that falls between the two realms. You can probably hear in the music of the soundtrack that it sounds very similar to lots of movie soundtracks, like The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, have all been inspired by this opera. In fact, it's sort of the pinpoint of mythology in an opera. It's sort of exactly Wagner's image of what an opera should be, kind of inspired by mythology and hope, and kind of the root of basic human compassion. Wagner had a theory called Gesundheitswerk, which is where art should come together to create totality. It should be a sense of all emotions being consumed at the same time. In fact, for this opera, Wagner created a backdrop that would move in time for this entire opera. It worked really nicely for the first performance, but it did break a little bit a few performances after. Wagner had to write a few extra lines of music just in case the curtain wouldn't fall properly. However, it didn't work out to be a problem for the first performance. This is the first sense of structure that we really get in the overture. It's an ostinato played by the strings. Occasionally they do tremolo, and then underneath we get this amazing sort of piercing in our hearts, as Antonio Pappano calls it, when the brass comes in. So why is this the first sense of structure that we really have? Well, if we listen to the opening again that I played before, we begin to realise that the piece actually doesn't fall on the first crotchet. There's a crotchet rest, and then the piece starts. And I think it's because this overture is about space rather than time. Wagner wants to fill this amazingly huge theatre that is Bayreuth, but he doesn't want any clear direction because the character's confused. Parsifal is between these two worlds, and he's journeying, and this journey is spontaneous. I think that's really interesting. People have also argued that the first crescendo, so up to about this point, that's about suffering. And the second section, so from the C, is about the sword. People have also referred to this section as the Dresden Amen. Obviously, for the reasons I showed you earlier, again, you can fit the words of the communion or the Eucharist very clearly to the opening. I think that's really interesting as well, which highly kind of implies that the piece is about Christianity and finding hope. There's so many symbols throughout this entire opera. In fact, there's a whole scene halfway through where they're just giving communion, and I think that's really powerful. The piece is called the Dresden Amen, and again, the piece begins in A flat and later goes to C minor, and I think that's really interesting. Again, two very, very dark keys, which I think is very typical of Wagner, but also quite complex keys. And it's a very complex instrumental piece to begin with. It builds slowly, beginning with this lovely sort of opening theme, and then later the strings come in, and later the horns play exactly the same sort of melody. Like I said before, this piece is inspired by mythology, so it's really interesting that we have these really, really rich themes there. Again, this piece is inspired by Wagner's and Schopenhauer's philosophy of compassion. The melody evolves with time, dipping in and out of these wonderful chromatic passages. The entire opera seems to have symbols of Christianity, which I think is really great, really interesting. You don't see many operas that are explicitly about Christianity rather than love. In fact, the character Parsifal seems to find love in hope rather than a specific character, and I think that's really interesting in itself. However, the opera does have some rather dark undertones. The Judaism divide here is a problem. Many people have argued that Kundry, who's a character, his voice is animalistic and anti-Jewish. In fact, in Benjamin Binder's Kundry and the Jewish Voice, it is exactly this point that's argued. A contrary point to this is the fact that Hermann Levy conducted this piece in the initial phases. King Ludwig II was asked this as a favour to Wagner because Wagner owed him a huge deficit. He was in fact the patron of Wagner and his works and loaned a lot of money into the production and construction of Bayreuth. The 30-year embargo was placed on the opera. However, it was performed at multiple places, including New York, the Metropolitan, Covent Garden in London, and also in Amsterdam. So the most important question here is, what is the opera actually about? I think that's really interesting, and I think many critics have asked the same question. And I think even though there are clear religious undertones that are sometimes quite difficult to get through, I think the opera is about compassion and hope. And I hope that when you get the chance to see it, you will also enjoy it as much as I did.